It's been a good while since I've done any glaze testing, and I desperately need to get experimenting again. Yet, before I can do that, I have to replenish my dwindling supply of glaze test tiles, as I only have a handful of porcelain ones left. So, in this video, I'll be taking you through the process of how I make my tiles. And for those of you who don't know what these are, they're essentially standalone tiles which you can coat with experimental glazes and fire in the kiln alongside your pots. The vertical section is dipped into a small amount of the test glaze, and the horizontal section beneath it acts like a stand, keeping the tiles steady and stable and upright as it fires. I'm going to be using exceedingly soft clay to throw these, as there's practically no height in them. The clay doesn't need much strength, and the material being softer will make it easier to center, open out, and shape. I'll also be throwing the test tiles on bats, as trying to lift them off the wheel after they've been thrown without one would be practically impossible. But before I can begin throwing the test tiles, I first need to throw the clay bat onto which the MDF rounds, the other bats, will stick onto. This is just a very simple disc of clay that's flattened, scraped clean of slip, dried out to more or less leather hard, and then a series of grooves are pressed into the top. These help the wood stick onto it. As for the test tiles, I'll be throwing these from about 4 pounds of clay, which is about 1.8 kilograms. These soft lumps of clay can be difficult to wedge up and knead properly, as it sticks very easily to the tabletop. To get around this somewhat, you can wedge on plaster or on canvas, or, like I do here, I simply move around on the tabletop. This way, there isn't one spot that absorbs too much water and becomes very sticky to wedge on. Generally speaking, your main workbench in the studio should be made from a material that is quite absorbent, as if it were completely sealed and varnished. It would stick to the clay even worse. My tabletop is made from 18mm birch ply, which I normally oil and sand once or twice a year. To attach the bat on which my test tiles will be thrown on, I take some water and slip and brush it over the back. The bat is then tap centered in place and then rubbed back and forth in situ, which really helps to weld the wood and clay together. A patch in the middle is lightly dampened, and it's onto this the clay is firmly thrown against. Now, the way you make these is by throwing a shape that you can cut into many individual tiles. This is the approximate shape I need, and so in theory, to make this, all I have to do is to throw a circular pot with a cross section like this. So, to begin with, I center the soft clay like normal. It's coned up and down 2 or 3 times, as this helps the particles that make up the clay align, thus becoming more plastic and easier to throw with. It's essentially like wedging on the wheel. This lump of clay is then pressed gradually into a flat disc, using the flat side of my palm to do so. I then firmly press my fingers into the very centre all the way to the wood underneath. When I can feel my fingertips scraping on the MDF, I then again, very gradually, begin to stretch this donut of clay out across the bat. This is a process that requires a lot of water and slip, as you really want the clay to flow quite freely over the wood as it's forced out wider and wider. As my fingers inside draw the clay out, the palm of my left hand and most of my right hand are firmly clasped around the ring of clay with a small soaked sponge held between them to make sure nothing sticks. It's very easy when doing this for one side of the ring to become dislodged or to begin undulating, and so by interlocking both my hands together as I work, I'm able to grip and maneuver the lump of clay more securely. With the ring of clay right on the edge of the bat, I'll sponge away any slip or water left inside the hollow, and then scrape away the leftover film of clay that covers the base. It's kinder on your hands to do this with a tool, as opposed to scraping all of it away with your fingertips. Next, I'm going to begin shaping this donut of clay into that upside down T shape I showed you earlier. I begin by pressing the clay into a flat section either side of the taller part left in the middle. This central, thicker, expansive clay is then squeezed up, and I make sure to keep the wall leaning in ever so slightly, as this will make the tiles more stable once cut. I'm throwing this batch of test tiles a bit thicker than my last, with more of a squared off top. This way I can see how the glaze settles on a flat surface more easily. The throwing gauge you can see in the background in this instance is only measuring height. This way each ring of test tiles I throw will be approximately the same, but I'm not so concerned about the width. Ultimately, in many ways, as these are just test tiles, they don't have to be pristine, perfect objects. But I do think it's a good idea to finish them to a similar degree and aesthetic to the actual pots you make. This way, the tiles will give you more relevant information. For example, if I was to make these very textural and dotted with fingerprints, they'd have no relevance to the actual body of work I create, making it more difficult to draw any real, useful information out of them. So I scrape the outer wall to be very clean and straight, much like the trimmed surface of my actual pots. And I leave subtle throwing rings on the inside, again mimicking the pots I make. Then I tidy up the horizontal section of the tile, pressing it flat and scraping away slip. Yet they don't have to be perfect at this stage, as there will be an opportunity to trim these later on. And that's one ring finished. You may have noticed that I didn't wire it through, and that's something I'll do the following morning once the clay is dried out somewhat. For now, the bat is simply pried off and set aside, and now the next can be thrown. For this second one, I'm going to throw a step in the wall. This simple feature is one I use quite a lot in my work, so it makes sense to have a few test tiles like this, so I can see how some glazes react to a ledge like this, as some glazes, if they're very stable, can simply flood a feature like this, smothering and hiding it, whereas some will pull and break over it wonderfully. And lastly, I threw a shape with an angular exterior, again made to imitate some of the shapes my pots have. As the weather has been really cold and damp recently, I'll leave these uncovered overnight. This way there's a chance I'll be able to finish them tomorrow. And this, by the way, is what happens if you spin the wheel too quickly after the wall has been drawn up. A good way of making plates, perhaps, but hard to control, consistently at least. Early the following morning, and the rims of these have really firmed up, yet the lower section of the walls are really still quite soft, so I will leave them like this, partly covered, in a place in the studio where there's a strong draft to help firm up the soft clay. A few hours later, and these are mostly leather hard, but I'm catching them slightly on the soft side, mainly so I can wire them off. You could, in theory, do this as soon as you've thrown them, but I find I get a neater result if I wait a bit. So I centre the bat and secure it in place with a few dots of clay pressed around it. At this point, I can do a bit of tidying up, such as trimming the top flat and straightening out this edge on the inside. But again, in theory, you don't have to do any of this. I just find it quite difficult to leave things I've made rough and ready, and there's a compulsion in me to finish them to a certain degree, otherwise I know I won't be happy. So inevitably I end up turning all the walls and the foot, which is an easier task to do before the tiles have been cut off the bat, and you'll see why in a moment. With the tiles trimmed to my liking, I'll now separate them from the bat. To do this, I slice down with the wire through the wall until I can feel it on the wooden bat. I then hold the wire firmly in place and spin the wheel, before very carefully removing the wire through the same incision I came in through. I then very gently lift the tile off the bat, breaking any sticky seal there might be between them that could otherwise make it hard to flip over later. I then place another bat on top and flip the entire ring upside down. This way the shape isn't distorted or bent, which could very well happen if you flipped it over with just your hands. With the bat removed, I'll now let these sit out and slowly dry until the entire piece is the exact same consistency, just on the firm side of leather hard. If you try this and you haven't secured your bat firmly enough, this can happen. So make sure when you're securing the MDF round onto the wheel that you press enough clay around it, and it's even easier if you have a bat system in which the wood can slot into, or pins in the wheel head, onto which the bat fits over. But essentially, the bat has to be very securely locked in place for this to work. And if you are finding it difficult, simply do this the moment they've been thrown. And lastly, here's the stepped variant. The wooden bat is tap-centered in place and then secured with about 10 pieces of soft clay pushed around the bat. And as I do this, I press down on the wood in the middle too. This way the pressure of the clay being pushed against the wood doesn't shift the bat off center. If you let the clay towards the base get too firm before trying this, you may have a difficult time sliding the wire neatly beneath it. You could also try wiring it off from front to back, like you do with a normal pot. You just have to make sure you throw your test tile slightly smaller than the bat itself. That way there's space for the wire to slide. But by doing this, you may find that the shape is distorted as you slide the wire underneath, as these pots have no base, and it's that expansive clay which helps strengthen the pot, so it maintains its shape. I had to leave these rings of test tiles overnight to dry further, as the bases were still quite sticky, so I wrapped the walls up in plastic and pinned it all in place with a few kiln props. And then, for some good housekeeping, I scrape all the clay off the bats before it gets too dry and dusty. The following morning and the test tile rings are now completely leather hard. So I take them back to the wheel, and once again you could skip this, as there's really no need to tidy up the bottoms, but I'd rather have neat tiles than ones covered in burrs of clay and with rough, unfinished lines. And this only takes about a minute or so with each ring, as I smooth the corners of the base, and I trim in such a way that I don't let the tool catch on that spinning groove that spins around. It's then burnished with my fingertips, the ring flipped over, and finally, the most satisfying part of the process can begin. I start by slicing away a slither either side of that incision I made. And for this task, I'm using one of these, a scraper with a sharp metal edge, which I've sharpened with a diamond pad just for this task. You just need to make sure that the height of the blade is taller than the test tiles you've made. The groove cut with the wire will never be as neat as what this scraper can do, hence why I remove 2 bits like this either side of that initial cut. And here's the cross section, which isn't too dissimilar to the initial sketch I drew. And with this, I'll now begin cutting away larger tiles as I slowly spin the ring of clay around. Quick, confident slices are key here, and if the clay is in any way too sticky, you won't get a clean slice all the way through. And it's pressing through the wider base which is the trickiest bit, as there's obviously more resistance. This process is a lot like making pancakes, I think. Your first few attempts might not be very good, but once you've got the hang of it, and the leather hard clay is in just the right condition, it really is quite easy. Upon seeing this test tile, I felt that certain sections of it were still a bit too thick. I don't want to be wasteful with this clay, and if I feel like they're a bit heavy or there's too much material in one of the walls, especially when it comes to material in the base, it's still possible to trim that away at this stage. You can neaten up the outside too. You can carve grooves in the tiles. You can paint slip on them, brush iron over the surface, print them with texture or symbols, anything really. They're your test tiles. And the simplicity of mine doesn't mean that yours have to be simple too. These just happen to relate to my specific aesthetic, the style of pots I create. You can see the ragged edge left by the initial wire cut here, It isn't perfectly straight, so I simply remove a few millimeters of material from either side. Towards the end, I figured out that I don't have to move each tile after it's cut. I feel like there's a lot of trial and error in making these tiles and figuring out the most efficient method. They don't have to be perfect, but they do need to be neat and tidy, and they have to be made relatively quickly. And all in all, throwing 8 of these rings, trimming them and cutting them didn't take long. Yet at the same time, test tiles like this can be hand-built, press-molded, cast, or extruded, which I'd argue is the fastest method. I specialise in wheel-thrown work. Everything I make is on the wheel, and I enjoy the process of figuring out the best way of making something with the options I have. With that said, I'd love to hear about how you do it, so leave a comment with your method, and if you do anything differently, I'd like to hear about that too. The one thing you'll get when using a scraper like this is some raised edges, some burrs of clay where the scraper pushed through. You can absolutely leave these, they aren't the end of the world, but they could cause some glazes to settle irregularly over them. So the very last thing I do for each tile is fettle any edge like this, a process that probably takes about 20 to 30 seconds per tile. It's a repetitive, laborious task, but with a good podcast or audiobook and a cup of coffee, it goes by quickly. I work over a basin of warm water to do this. This collects all the burrs of clay and scraps that are removed from the tile, and it makes it very easy to recycle all that material afterwards. At the end of the day, these test tiles might be things I hang on to for years, so I'd prefer that they're finished to a high degree, rather than being left with sloppy edges. But I think the next time I make these, I'll try cutting them with an even sharper implement to minimise the time spent on this final step. In theory, it might be quicker to bisque fire them rough and then sand away the burrs of clay, or toss them all together in a large container to soften the edges. Yet both of those are relatively dusty processes, and the materials removed can't be recycled. And at last, here are the 3 finished styles of test tiles I've made. All that needs to happen now is for these to slowly dry out until they're bone dry, and then I'll bisque fire the stoneware to 1000 degrees Celsius, and then, finally, they can be used to test glazes. If that's a process you'd like to watch in more detail, I've actually made a video that's all about that topic, a link to which you'll find on screen now and in the description below. Good luck with the test tiles you make, and be sure to watch other makers' videos on the topic too, as I'm sure there's a whole variety of methods and ways of producing them. This video just shows how I do it. Thank you for taking the time to watch, and I'll see you next time.